Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. This is the Erudition Interactive Black History and Knowledge session. I am Eddie Phillips, and we are here again for another Thursday to go over some history, some knowledge, and to basically have a good interactive time asking questions and answering questions and delving in. I hope all of you had a great Easter and a great week so far as we get ready to go and enter into a new weekend. Um, if you're new to the program, this interactive session is um, dedicated to teaching history, providing knowledge and understanding. Uh, we spend a lot of time on here discussing our Black history, talking about our past, and trying to provide you with a better understanding of just where we come from, knowledge, right? It's not a program that we do this every week. It's not a program that we take lightly because it is very important that we talk about these issues, especially in the current state of our world and what we're going through in this country, particularly. So I don't want to go and belabor too much more. Tonight, what I wanted to talk about on this session is teaching. Last week, we spent a great amount of time talking about teaching and how we teach within our homes and how we provide information to our families, our children, and how we all learn together. But unfortunately, one of the issues that we have had in this country, particularly, but as I look at information all over the world, we have this issue with teaching. I don't know if you've seen all of the different things that have come out on TikTok, social media with teachers saying that they're leaving their jobs all across the country. People saying that they're tired of it because rather it be the students, rather it be whatever. But one of the things I thought about this week was the demographics of that and how we don't really talk about our teachers in this country and what they go through. What is the structure of teaching in this country? If I were to ask people just at random, right, how old do you think the average teacher is in this country? If I were to ask you the demographics of any part of the teaching profession, and this is funny because I actually asked people, teachers, if they would come on a program tonight, some that I know, and they kind of, and I understand it. A lot of us don't want to speak to the issues and the problems, and then some people are afraid of how it will affect their job and how it'll be seen. So I get all of that, but it is still something that we should talk about. Sorry about that. So tonight, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Black history, but we're going to talk about teachers, and then we're going to get into how we teach. Um, and for me, it comes down to how we teach Black history. So we're going to go into that tonight, and I'm not going to belabor it anymore. I was trying to get a little bit of time for more people to come in, but we're going to move on and try to do this. So here we are. Right now, we're looking at this country, and if you know anything that you're watching the news media lately, you see people talking about critical race theory. You hear people talking about not wanting to teach um, anything about history that will offend other people. So that's what I wanted to conquer to talk about tonight. First thing I want to go into, though, is some of the subjects of interest. This will not be an immediate quick lesson. We're going to cover some of this week, and we're going to probably cover a little bit more of it next week, because we will have to do that in order to give it its kind of get a better view for you guys to be able to see. A better understanding of what's going on here. So let's get into it. First, we want to talk about, probably not, we're going to get into American teachers, some of the facts, and then we're going to get into the forest and the shrubs. And if you don't know what the forest and the shrubs are, that's a term that is taken from Llewellyn, who talks about teaching history. And we'll get into that later on. Probably next week, we'll get into Beyond School, and we'll talk about interactive, which is what we try to do here on this program every Thursday. So, Mike, good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us, man. So, what does it mean? Let me give you a couple of facts here that we don't know. Roughly, and some of these facts are taken from just the last statistics that were pulled right around 2020. But around that time, and a lot of this hasn't changed much, right? We had about 4 million, a little over 4 million teachers currently employed in the United States. Most of all the teachers in the United States are white female, white women. It's not to be racist, it's just the facts. The average age of the employed teacher is roughly about 42 years old. And as we said before, most teachers are white, followed by Hispanic and Latinos, and then followed by Blacks, or if you want to be called African Americans. However, there is a huge teacher shortage in this country. Teachers are paid on an average of maybe like $47,000 a year. That is average, but that does not mean that all teachers are making that, right? Teachers' average starting salary is usually around $34,000 a year in certain areas. So, what does that mean? That means that as we look through this country, we see that we have about 4 million teachers. We also note from this that the representation of us out here, as I say about us African Americans, is small. And so there is a significant thing that we have to consider with this, because as we go through this lesson tonight, I want you to consider that these facts. We send our children to school, well, some of us, and what we do is we send them to the teachers for 8 to 9 hours for them to basically be the caretakers and the people. Hey, Dad, good to see you. Be the caretakers of our young, right? From kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade. And so a lot of time is spent with teachers, good or bad. And because they spend so much time with these teachers, we need to know who's teaching our kids. And it's abysmal to me that when I talk to people about this, many do not know. Mike said, what percentage of that is male? And we're going to get into that, my brother, because that's an important part there. It's a huge part that we're going to talk about tonight, because we're not here to say that women shouldn't teach, but we're going to get into the fact of how does it affect. I hear people talk about young folks in inner cities and cities, young Black men predominantly. And so, well, they weren't taught right, right? Who taught them this? Why do they act a certain way? And so when we consider that these young men are, and women, but we're talking about young men right at this moment, spend so much time with their teachers. And yet many of us don't consider who's teaching them. When you look at this stat here, I'm going to blow this up. This thing says right here, right? We're looking at male teachers, as Mike just said, role models. 74.3% of American teachers are female, Women have been the predominant educators. They have been the people who are responsible for educating our children for the better part of almost 3 decades. They have been the overwhelming educators, up to 80% in this country. And it can be argued that the lack of male teachers affects the outlook of male students by reducing the idea of a role model, by not giving them an actual example that they can look at to see themselves reach a status of higher learning. And when you don't have a role model to identify with every day on a daily basis, it can mess with your mind. The Black community, as we just said in the earlier slide, suffers the most because they have the least representation in the fields of teaching. They are the least represented. And we also have one of the highest dropout rates in schools, specifically in the idea of Black men. And because I'm not saying all of us, people drop their kids off at school and they go and they leave. What winds up happening is that there is no representation, no mentorship, no role model. And it should be obvious to our communities, to our families, to our churches. Even when we watch the activities online, that we need to provide training. We need to, like what we do here, to teach our young people outside of that traditional brick and mortar school. Because if you let your child go from kindergarten to 12th grade with the idea that he is being or she is being guided by teachers, you're wrong. Because no matter how good that teacher is, they cannot take the place of that family or that parent or the engagement or the role model. And now that you know that 74.3% by last statistics, and early statistics says almost 80% of it is female. Now, some of you will get mad and say, Eddie, what are you saying? Are you saying that women can't? No, I'm not saying that. But it should be stated that women are doing better over the last 4 decades in school than any male in any group, white, Black, Latino, Asian, whatever. Because representation has a point. It's the reason why we want representation in our jobs, in our activities. We want equality because we want everybody to feel like they have a place. But we send our young men to these schools and we are not providing them with the mentorship. And unfortunately, if you look at the tables, just within the last decade, and you'll see that lack of representation. And then you wonder why young men, especially our young Black men, are in the state that they're in. This has to be talked about. Before we ever get into how we learn, who's teaching us? It is frustrating. This slide speaks to me also, because even when we have male teachers in the system, what are they teaching? What are they teaching? The stats show that women dominate the early education of our children. Men are not represented in these classes, and the effects are felt early in child development. When we look at what is called the 4th grade failure syndrome in Black young men, where we have Black young men going into school reading at the 98th percentile, and by 4th grade, they are dropping off to 35, 10, 7, 4. And their reading progression drops to at least 1.3, 1.7%. even though some of them were taught to read before they ever went into school. Young men have no role models and do not get the mentorship or the visual stimuli psychologically that they may need to identify. And as I said last week, if we don't invest the time in our communities, in our churches, in our families to help groom young men, every Thursday I come on and I teach a lesson. And I hope that many of you are sharing these lessons with your young people, or at least taking what we talk about in these lessons and having discussions with your young people. And unfortunately, we can see the effects of it not happening. Mike said, do you think that's because more people are more comfortable with the female teachers? There is no emphasis, and there has not been emphasis to have Black males as teachers. That is a historical thing, right? Of having Black male teachers teach young girls, particularly white girls. And I hate to say it, but there is evidence to the kind that shows that there is an uncomfortableness in America. It has always been. And if you do not believe that and you think that that is a racial statement, I want you to go look at the history of when we integrated the schools after Brown versus Board of Education. The major thing that was said was, my young white princess will not sit in classrooms with that hulking Black brute, with that N-word. And unfortunately, that attitude still stays in some people's minds. And so we have to use mentorship and other methods outside of the normal construction to teach our young people. But if we look back at this slide, what do we see here? We see that males, white, Black, whatever, teach auto collision, automotive. That is the biggest, largest 100% of what males are teaching. When you look at the actual teacher, that means he's teaching math, history, science, whatever. You can see that those teachers are still within 25%. When you get down to teaching preschool, toddlers, kindergarten, we see males in a 3 to 2% ratio. Where females are 100%. Without that male role model, we can run into problems. Psychologically, we know this to be the fact. Systemically, we know that this is an issue. That school to prison pipeline that they so fervently talked about. But the solution is, one, identifying the problem, which many of us and those who are with us tonight and may watch it later, I want you to go and look these statistics up. Know who's teaching your kids. Another slide. We have to look at how teachers are rarely involved, right? And how the ethnicity plays into it. If we say that 72.3% are white, 10% are Black, that's the amount of Black teachers, at least until 2019. And now we're seeing a fluctuation going on in teachers now, where a lot of teachers are saying, I don't want to teach anymore because these kids are too violent. These kids are too uncontrollable. I don't have the ability to control them. And majority of them are white. And Black or African American representation in schools are abysmal. I mean, the teachers are, it's almost as if it doesn't exist. Blacks only, as we see, only make up 10% of the teaching population. And think about this. Black children make up about 25%, on average, 25% of all students within this country. But here's the catch, ladies and gentlemen. But they compromise 46%, almost 50% of special education students. Yes, our children make up almost half of those who are considered to have learning disabilities. And because a huge part of that 72.3% is white female, who sometimes this is the first Black male of any kind she has ever had to deal with when she becomes a teacher. She doesn't know how to deal with that. One study says about 65% of female educators list Black young men as behavioral disorder problems. They say that these students are consistent, this is quoted, consistently and casually affected by out-of-school factors such as poverty, poor nutrition, environmental stressors, and exposure to environmental toxins, cocaine, drugs. And because this exposure influences them in irregular ways, it affects these children and they don't know how to operate properly in schools. This is what is being said. This is what is being put out here. But many of us don't ask that question. Who's teaching your kids? Don't ask the question to our kids. What are you learning? We are finding women in schools who have sexually assaulted teachers. Black men confessing that I've had these experiences throughout my school time where a teacher touched me and I thought it was inappropriate, but I didn't say anything. People are bringing their racial politics, their angsts, and their issues into the school. Teachers are saying they find it hard to teach Black history. Some, not all, because they don't want the kids to feel a certain kind of way. They don't want a division in the course, in the classroom. But because there is no Black representation in the school, who's to push back on that? When white teachers teach Black history, I had my son came up recently and asked and said to me, "Dad, are the Egyptians Black or white?" Because my teacher put out a picture that they were white. And don't go into the ideas that really qualify who people are in history. But we don't ask who's teaching our kids. Brothers, pick on the brothers, don't see value, a lot of them, in being a teacher. I understand it. There's no money in it. I say that all the time myself. They gravitate more, I think Mike said it earlier, to the gym, right? To auto mechanics, to something that is physical and male. Because for the most part of their early life, I ain't seen no teachers that look like me. And if I do see them, there's one individual. And sometimes he act like he don't even want to be, he or she don't even want to be there. That affects your consciousness. The other thing I want to talk about, as we're on this teacher thing, is the age of the teachers. I thought for a long time, for many years, I thought that teachers were around 20, 30 years old. From my experience growing up, I was shocked to find out that the average teacher nowadays is in their 40s, 40, 44 years old. And I was even more shocked to find that they don't stay teaching very long. My nephew, I always thought that early child development teaching was mostly a woman's field because historically that's the position women have been given. A maternal job like nurse or server because of internalized misogyny. I don't know if I would agree that their sex directly dictates their judgment towards Black students. It doesn't matter that we have to understand something. And I think and that's a great question, my nephew, and I'm glad that you make this point, because I want to talk to that. Here's the thing. We put these ideas out here as if they are, they don't have any context out here. The truth of the matter is that there is a huge, huge issue when you do not have proper representation. I would argue that, yes, there shouldn't be any direct correlation. But the evidence to the kind does not suggest that. If we look through and we look over the last 40 years, throughout most of my lifetime, and you see what has happened in the progress of our schools, and I say progress to be very sardonic and sarcastic, we have a lot of people who are failing in schools. When we talk about, and I want you to go look this up, when we start talking about those fourth grade failure syndromes in the Black community, and when you actually talk to these young men and you find out that a lot of it had to do with the fact that the teacher never wants to listen to me. I'm not hollering at her, but she gets mad at me. Representation is huge. Representation in the Supreme Court, in Congress, at your job, no matter where you are, you need that representation so that people can understand you. What you're going through. What are you trying to say? But if you've been programmed by a racist mentality within the United States, that's what CRT talks about, a systemic problem that tells us and dictates to us that you are secondary. Rather, these people believe it or not, there are many who do. There are systems in place that we have shown and proven to push our young people into duress. There are systems in place that align our young people into special education programs that affect them for the rest of their child development. And it is done at an early age. If you tell someone that they're educably mentally retarded, that's what that is called, an EMR. They're an EMR child. That stays with them. It stays with them on their record, and it stays with them in their consciousness. And the statistics show you how many white female teachers align and assign these Black young men into that trap. because they socialistically cannot speak to them or understand what it means, or have been programmed by society that when a young black boy goes up and says, I don't understand this, he's aggressive, he's mean. These thug, brute mentalities still feed into our society and influence a lot of our decision making. Implicit bias studies have shown that white people in this country, whether they liberal or conservative, see black children as older than what they are. This is why they are aggressive towards them. That's why the cops will beat a 7-year-old black boy down to the ground, thinking he's 14, 15 years old. And this feeds into our schools. Mike, we were never encouraged to go into the education field. We were always told learn a trade if you were not the athletic type with a chance of playing sports professionally. And I'm all for you going for a trade. But when we talk about education, watch and look, see the statistics, see what's going on with our children, about young men in about 5th grade. I have 4 of them. When they start to feel attacked, when they start to feel ignored, when they start to feel like the teacher is treating me a certain kind of way, they're not listening to me. Those are real issues. And if you're sending your child only to a school with the idea that they're going to groom them, and then wondering why your child gets disenfranchised from school and drops out, doesn't go to school, cuts class, does something else. I'll give you my personal history. Now, I may have said this before. I had a teacher who sat and told me, because I was hanging around with a lot of my friends who didn't go to class. And I got caught up into it for a while too. And this teacher told us to our face, you're either going to wind up dead or in jail, because that's all y'all good for. He didn't know some of us from a hole in the head. It wasn't our teacher per se, but this was his mentality. Having white teachers tell you that your children have problems is a serious thing. Because if you let me give an example of a woman's testimony. She was told by a teacher that her son, black son, had an education problem. He couldn't learn. Not that he was retarded or he had some kind of, but the reality is he couldn't learn. So they suggested that she put him in special education. She put him on some drugs to help him to be able to focus. This is a young mother. And we have young mothers out here. She was 17 years old with her child. And she didn't know what to do. She didn't have parents to go ask because she was trying to raise her child by herself. And as I read her story, she talked about how when she sat at the table, the principal and the psychologist and the teacher, they all basically just appeared in front of her and said, this is what's wrong with your child, but we're going to help you fix it. And she agreed, and she put her child on drugs, and she put him through all of this stuff. And unfortunately, her child started having other issues, having depression issues, feeling that he was not very smart, feeling that he was less than, because his friends, people he knew, they were in regular classes. And he started to get away from her. But the only thing that helped was the church she went to had people, men, who said, you know what? They would come and spend time with this young man. They would take them, come and get him on the weekends. They would help him with his homework. And this young man, he excelled. He flopped in a year from being in this idea of special education to far exceeding what they thought. So when I hear people say that this is not me clowning women, this is me telling you a fact that we need to face and we need to understand. That's what this network is about. We need to understand that. Because we have gotten so much into the idea that the male is not necessarily needed to be there. If he ain't going to be there as a teacher, you better well get somebody that you trust or somebody that can help your children to understand. Because if not, some may survive. Go in the military, find somebody, go someplace where they're giving those examples and they grow. Some will not. They will go down the path of least resistance. They will find the gang member, the drug dealer, the criminal who will become their mentor. They do. They love throwing the ADHD around. And so many of our young men, it's a joke in society. I got ADHD. When you look, I was saying earlier, look at the salaries. If you look at that bottom little clip right there, you see the salary of Black and African Americans. So even when they become teachers, they're not making the money that everybody else is making. And if you look at the other slides, you'll see, right, that at the highest 40%, these are the statistics from teachers teaching 1 to 2 years. Less than 20% teaching 11 plus years. People don't stay with teaching. They get in, they affect your children, they realize and they get out. They go do something else. So if you're thinking that this is the old teacher of old who's going to sit here with you and is going to say, hey, look, I'm going to work with your child. We don't have a lot of those 24 plus year teachers anymore. People don't have the patience. People don't want to do it. And if they do it, they're not getting paid. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to clown teachers tonight. You may think I am. What I'm really here to do is to get you to start to think. Get you to start thinking outside the box on who's instructing and teaching your kids. Firstly. Secondly, I want you to start thinking about how do you affect the education of your children. If I have all of these problems going on in teaching, then what do I do? People got really upset during the pandemic because they pulled all these kids out of school and folks said, I got to go to work and I'm not a math teacher, a history teacher, an English teacher. I cannot sit here and do this with these kids. And I understood some of it. I really did, because we all get busy. We have things that we got to do. But in another part of me started to think, well, if you can't teach your child or qualify a lesson that your child has learned, then maybe you should be in them books with that child. I know, don't just get off the program. It's a hard thing to hear. But if your child is doing math a certain way, that's your child. And you say, man, I don't know what that math is. Maybe you can sit down there for a minute and learn it. Tell you what that does. That influences your child. My mother and father sat down here and learned this with me. My uncle, auntie, grandma, whoever, they learned this with me. It's something where you can shoot back at them. It's a conversation, even if you don't learn it that well. Too many people are like, not my job. Forgetting that historically, we didn't always have schools as you see them. And that the African American, the black man or woman, had to teach their kids at home because the quality of books at the school were not right. And that 3 generations of African Americans learned. That's why you have the historical black colleges. They learned what the value of an education was because a slave knew what it meant to not be able to learn anything. And I hear people say, I'm too old, I don't want to learn nothing new. Okay, well, then you can't complain when your child is disenfranchised because they're not getting that help at school. Then they come home and they're not getting that help from you. You have to do it. Yes, we used to do old school versus new school math with our boys. It's important because now we're talking about a computer math, right? They're doing math on how quickly, because computers move quickly. We got to learn. We should be learning throughout every day of our life. Didn't say you had to master it, but you learned it. That moves me to my other subject tonight. I get here to teach history. I get on every Thursday. And let me tell you folks something out here. I have seen shows throughout social media where people are teaching you how to twerk. People are teaching you how to pick up on a girl. I done seen shows, people got stuff out here that blows my mind. And yet, none of those things, in my opinion, are going to help you to have a better understanding of who you are, where you're going. Our kids are not being taught history. And folks say, well, what do we care about history? Well, we do care. When they are taught, they're taught in these forestry ideas of one issue. We're going to spend 2 days talking about George Washington, and that's it. And isolate him and not talk about the period of time. So on this slide that I put on, I want to tell you, it is not wise to learn history as a hasty accumulation of information. We don't need to be fooled with a fire hydrant, a fire hose, and boil it down. It needs to be sectionalized. It needs to be talked about. We got to teach history as it's relatable to this life right now. Is it important to where we are right now? How does it affect us? How does it affect the way we think? You got to choose some topics. I say 10, some say 30, some say more than that. I'm talking about you, not just the teacher. Choose something to teach blocks of history or shrubs, bushes, little things for them to be able to digest. If you're going to talk about Frederick Douglass, his slave life, who Frederick Douglass was, how he escaped, he became an abolitionist. How did he influence or help with getting blacks to fight in the Civil War? What was his activities after the Civil War? Similarly with John Brown. He was an abolitionist. Who was John Brown? What's his life? What happened in Bleeding, Kansas? What happened in Harper's Ferry? When he was executed, what did he say? Why does that still resound with us? You have to teach it in a person that is identifiable. And then ask them, how do these two men affect your life right now? Why do we still talk about them? Over 100-something years more after their death. Why do we still talk about them? Because the idea is that Frederick Douglass, escaping to freedom, he could talk about what it meant to be a slave. And because he was an educated man, he could talk about what it meant for a black man to be educated, to go out and speak against the very atrocities that were going on in the country. He could talk about, you could learn about his influence and what he had to see during the Civil War that led up to the Civil War. And then to look at what happened when the failure of Reconstruction happened. And how did Frederick Douglass deal with that as a racial issue that still affects us today? John Brown, a white man who was an abolitionist, who was not afraid to take a life because he believed that slavery was a sin and that should be enforceable by blood. Talk about what he did in Kansas. Talk about what he, when during the before the Civil War, people were trying to bring in slavery in other states. But you're talking about an individual. Talk about his execution and how he willfully walked to the execution and said and told the people that he was under the belief that the only way that the slavery issue in this country could ever be rectified was by blood. And that maybe being the catalyst to the Civil War. Talk about how when he was killed, bells rang in England. People all over the world identified with this idea of anti-slavery. But that's not taught in our schools. We teach these folks as passing by things in a forest of thought. And if you go too fast past that bush, you don't see it because you're focused on these other trees that you don't even have the concepts of yet to even get there. And we saw with our teacher things earlier, a lot of people don't stick around long enough to be good teachers to teach your kids this. There are questions you need to ask. I threw some questions in there. I asked when I think about, should I talk about history? Why is it important? One of my major questions is, will my kids need to know this in 50 years? When they old men, will this be something that they need to be teaching to their kids? Do they need to know about Brown versus the Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson? Do they need to know about the Dred Scott case, the Scottsboro Boys, Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin? Should we be discussing this so that they have something to identify with? Because hopefully these things will be gone, but do they need to know this? And does that older history, the Emmett Tills, the lynchings and the murders that happened in the 40s and the 50s, does that still affect us today? Everybody out here should know that it does. And if they know that information, how will it help and affect them? How will it help them? If you don't understand that United States versus Khrushchev was the reason why lynching was allowed and why civil rights workers, the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, why it was okay for the state to give those people bare minimum sentences, because the Supreme Court had said that it was okay for the states to decide on murder charges. That was not our federal responsibility. And so for decades, Black men and women were brutalized and killed. Is it important that they know those cases? That they get taught about those things? And lastly, can folks gain a deeper understanding from the subject? What does that mean? Will it make them delve further to learn more history so that their children, their progeny, understand how they got where they are? They can appreciate it. They have a sense of worth. My grandfather marched on Washington. My grandma was a part of the civil rights movement. My grandfather went out there, and he was a part of the marches in Baltimore for Freddie Gray. They did something. They got involved. They taught us. Because I'm going to tell you, they're not getting it in them schools. And it's hard. It's hard. I did this lesson tonight because I wanted you, those who do watch this, to understand this ain't an easy job, but it's worthwhile. You have deeper questions to consider, deeper things to think about. When I ask you those questions, did history change the cultures? This is what our school books should be doing. Was land or culture stolen from someone? How did that affect the society? Did the history make us break off into sectionalism? Because of that, was there a struggle for equal treatment or equality? Was there a change in how we did things in our technology? Inventions. Slaves invented so many different things, former slaves, in order to make lives easier for them to be able to do their jobs. Post-slavery. Your radiators, your street lights. And they changed the environment. Is it important to know that? If you know who Granville T. Woods is, then maybe you can understand that, man, I can have an idea and do something with that idea. If something bad happened, if we don't know our history, can that bad event happen again? Did we find any moral value, any things that lessons that we learned from this historical situation? Did you learn from the Nazis? Did you learn from 9/11? All of those things have reason that you need to be considering when we talk about history. And every Thursday, I get on, I do this show, and I try to do that for you. There's a question in the book I read where the person asked, why did slavery take a greater hold in the South than it did in the North? And people were like, because we're taught that people in the North were free. But that's a lie. There were freemen, but there were also slaves in the North. People came with their slaves to the North. Border sites had slaves. The reason why it became more popular was because of the warmer climates and the ability to grow crops longer. And because we don't seem to identify And to learn these things, ask these questions outside of the school books that are given to us as kids or are now given to our kids. We're falling into a trap. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to belabor too much. I only wanted to go into this first part this week. We have to do better. I don't know how much influence I have for this network to try to get us to do better, but I try. We are in a situation right now where we're seeing 12 and 13-year-old boys carjacking. We're having young kids sexually assaulted by young kids. We're having teachers throw their hands up and say, I'm leaving. We're having parents who during the pandemic say, well, it ain't my job to teach them. And somewhere in all of this, we expect our kids to be better, to do better. Innocent people are suffering. Innocent young people are suffering because of a lot of the lack of knowledge that I tried to cover tonight. You can do these things. We can help you. Programs like this. If you don't want to watch this program, other programs that are online that are teaching you. Vetting the history. Providing you with talking points for your kids. But sometimes, I talked to a brother recently, it feels like we're pulling people against their will. But every February, I get a huge thing that says Black History 365 days a year, knowledge 365 days a year. We need to be teaching our kids. Every February. And through the rest of the year, not our interest. We got to do better. I hope you get something from this episode tonight. We didn't have a lot of people on interactively tonight. That's okay. That's fine. I understand that. But I hope that you will share this episode, that you will share it with friends, family, that you'll have discussions. If you don't share the episode and you go and you have a discussion with your family about some of the things we talked about tonight, that's a win. That's a win. We got to do better. This year, Erudition is focused on our young people. And the first thing we got to do is identify some of the problems. Then figure out how we fix those problems. There's a great book. I've said it before. It's called Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. Great book by Jawanza Kunjufu, professor, very intelligent Black man. Did years of study on some of the things we talked about tonight. Get that book. Read it. It's not a big read. I think it's roughly about, maybe 200 pages. Learn. Help yours. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is my hour. I try not to keep this longer than an hour. I thank you for your time. I hope that you have a great rest of your week. And we will see you here again next Thursday. Please share this episode. Encourage people to watch the Erudition Network. Help us to help others. Thank you. Until I see you guys again, have a good week.